Welcome to Blockchain 2025. We explore how blockchain technology will affect major industries in the future.
Each episode dissects one industry, how it currently works, why blockchain can disrupt it, and some blockchain projects trying to be the solution.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
Welcome to episode 5 of season 2. This is Matt Aaron.
And this is Stuart James. Welcome back, Matt. Good to see you.
Yeah, man. Good to see you too. How's everything going out there in Serbia?
Everything is fine. It's roasting, and I'm just working away, working hard in all these blockchain aspects. Crypto life, it never sleeps, does it? There is no sleep for the crypto man.
Yeah, and there's I'd say pretty famous, at least among the nerds in cryptocurrency and blockchain dev, just the fact that 6 months in this industry feels like 3 years in a more stable traditional industry.
Yeah, or even less. I mean, I don't know about you, but I remember a time not so long ago, well, before I got into to crypto, so about 7 years ago, where time used to have some sort of relative meaning, but now it's just kind of all merged into one timeline, you know, days, nights, weeks, months. There is no concept of time anymore, and I blame it on crypto. So it doesn't really matter what time of the day it is anymore, does it? It's still happening the same.
It's really true, man. I mean, I'll wake up, it's probably because I'm drinking a lot of coffee, and I'm also microdosing acid. I'm doing a lot of stuff just on the mind side and energy side, but at the same time, Bitcoin.com is a global team. So I'll wake up at 1, and usually if I wake up at 1 a.m. when I'm sleeping, maybe I'll read and fall back asleep. But now I'll get on Telegram and see something's out there and like, hey, Matt, I need your feedback on this for the podcast, or the news team needs X, and I'll start typing, and then I'll send emails to people in Tokyo. I think because it's such a worldwide phenomenon that you end up talking to people on many different time zones, man. You're 7 time zones away from me. Obviously, I got New York, I got Tokyo. London is an hour ahead of you or behind you. Yeah. I'm sure you do that too, where they'll send weird time zones where like, hey, can you talk to me? GMT -4, and I have to search Google. I was like, can't you just say the name of a city so I can just say what time is it in New York, not like GMT -4? So you get the whole time zone vernacular. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
No, I agree. I mean, my own team is split between 7 or 8 different time zones. So we work in UTC, whatever that is, Universal Time Coordination or something like that. But yeah, I mean, when people are waking up and you're going to bed, it's strange. I was in the countryside for the weekend and I had very poor internet. I was down to E, which is before H, which is before 4G, basically the most useless internet connection possible. But it was really funny because time went so slowly when you had no internet. It was like, what's happening in Slack? I can't really access Slack, so doesn't matter. I'll look at these trees. Oh, these trees are kind of nice. And before you know it, you're back into some sort of normal time zone, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think just like adjusting to any age, we're entering the information age. There are some transition pains. And one of those, I think, is lack of attention span and just a constant low-level anxiety caused by notifications and connectivity, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, basically, if you're not taking modafinil or one of those type of nootropics nowadays, you've got no chance, really, do you? For our listeners who don't know what these are, I highly recommend, if you're in blockchain, to have a stash of modafinil for hard days. Or modafinil, however you want to pronounce it.
Hey, man, I got to put the legal disclaimer out there. I'm not sure. So listen, I've actually taken modafinil. I find it to be really strong.
I take quarters. Yeah.
Yeah, consult with your doctor first, please. But, honestly, when I took it, it wasn't the best experience. It was too strong for me, but maybe I took too much. But yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. In Silicon Valley, in coding, in startups, smart drugs, whether it's microdosing acid or mushrooms, modafinil, there's a lot of them. The nootropics, right? There's a whole nootropics stacks.
Yeah, there's all sorts of, all the nootropics, yeah.
Or just plain old drinking a lot of coffee, I mean, the research, I think, is still, there's not too many longitudinal studies going on. Maybe just stick to coffee. But either way, yeah, it's pretty intense. But yeah, man, Stuart, today we are talking about real estate. First off, define real estate. So you have the real estate industry in terms of just buying and selling houses, apartments, commercial real estate. But real estate can also include vacation rentals, apartment rentals, and things like that. Starting off, Stuart, what's your best real estate story that you can tell the audience?
I don't know, actually. I mean, as you say, it sort of spreads over a few different fields, and one of the other ones you didn't mention there, but it's probably worth mentioning at the moment, is construction as well, which is really the key to real estate in any sense, whether it's commercial, enterprise, or residential. Construction is obviously another huge area, which we'll get into at some point too. I don't know, I mean, we're talking about real estate here. I think we're more focusing on the residential aspect at the moment, and how obviously blockchain can come in and make that more secure, more efficient. More efficient is a key one to speed things up. But real estate is a slow industry, a really slow bureaucratic industry. We've all had dodgy landlords. We've all had our deposits blocked at some point in life when something's gone wrong. But I do remember one where I was much younger. This was like 10 years ago. In Edinburgh, I was living in what could probably be described as a squat. It was a pretty cool squat. It was huge, but there was like 9 people living in there. I remember a couple of my flatmates, shall we say, they weren't necessarily friends, were conducting quite a large marijuana deal in the living room for reasonably large amounts, and the landlord had come round to check the house. They'd obviously completely forgotten about it, and he'd popped his head into the living room, seen a huge brick of weed surrounded by huge bricks of money, and just sort of going, oh, sorry about that, left. And as far as I remember, the people in the house didn't even bother doing anything. They just went on as if nothing had happened. Actually, nothing did happen. He didn't even call the police, which is kind of funny. But none of us got our deposits back in that flat. So that was about £3,000 or something between the 9 of us that got docked by our landlord. And I'm assuming he took that as some sort of tax. So, yeah, the place was horrible, though. It was full of mice. It was huge, but it was just a complete squat. So, yeah, that was one of them. But in general, just getting a flat in the Western world is a nightmare. I don't know about yourself, but going through the rigmarole of agencies is a horrible, horrible thing.
For sure. And Stuart, I can think of funny just landlord stories as well. I know just like the amount of paperwork, and I think about proving how much money you have. Like, renting an apartment in Colombia, you have to have these people that vouch for you, and like it can be family members or friends, and they need to show like a minimum amount of income. I remember one time we had someone vouch for an apartment I rented, and he owned like 5 or 6 apartments, but he was retired, so he didn't really have much of a monthly income, and he was like disapproved. And yeah, you just spend all this money. It's like a couple $100 here in Colombia just to get a study to rent an apartment, and it takes 14 hours of your time. It's a big time suck. And then when you're buying a house in the United States, you know how many intermediaries that are involved in terms of title, deeds, registries, et cetera, 18. You have to go through 18 different ones just to buy a house.
And they all take their cut, right?
They all take their cut, and it's a lot of time. Yeah, like the closing fees. And I think that is a potential revolution. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best way to put it. But yeah, Stuart, let's go into the downsides of the current industry. What are some of the biggest downsides besides the intermediaries that you can think of?
Just to come back to what you were saying there, the real estate industry is huge. There's different sort of stats out there for how big it is, but somewhere around $150 to $200 trillion mark is what's touted, and 75% of that's residential houses. So just to say, you're talking about how many intermediaries there are to buy a house or even to rent a house. It's kind of obvious that this is such a huge industry that everyone's getting a little slice of the pie somewhere. So I think one of the main issues at the moment is certainly in the westernized, or let's say the first world countries, it's very difficult and expensive to buy a house. It should be simple. It should really be simple, much like what Bitcoin has done with financial transactions, where you can just send X amount of a cryptocurrency to someone else, it lands there, and you don't spend any money. You just spend a transaction fee. The same thing should really be applied to real estate. But at the moment, the bigger problems are in the developing world. Things like fraud, vulnerabilities, cybersecurity vulnerabilities. It's very vulnerable to external factors, political instabilities, wars, corruptions, these type of things. One of the examples we were looking at was Haiti, that had this huge earthquake, which left a couple of million or more people homeless. But after that, actually they'd lost their cadastre, which is where, the land registry office, which keeps control of all the title deeds and such, just went. It was destroyed. So all these people now who at one point did own a home legally don't really have any proof to go back and re-register that. And that in itself is quite a scary proposition, I'd say.
For sure. And I know going back to the early 20th century, there was an earthquake in San Francisco that destroyed all records. And I'm sure the real estate wasn't very valuable then, but as you know today, San Francisco is among the most valuable real estate in the world.
You could say valuable or overpriced. I'm not sure which one it is, but both are true, potentially.
Okay, obviously, When you talk about real estate, you have to think about, it's all about value, right? And this, obviously the word expensive, I mean, it's very, per square meter, per square foot, it's a very high price. But if you compare San Francisco to places like Vancouver and Hong Kong, there's one main difference. And I've seen people talk about this, is that San Francisco real estate, Uber and Airbnb, which we're going to talk about a little bit on the show, are going to go public. And all of a sudden, you're going to have a lot of instant, billionaires or people with millions and millions of dollars, and they're going to start buying real estate in San Francisco. So some people see San Francisco as an investment opportunity right now.
Yeah, Vancouver's a good one as well. I have a few friends over there, one of them who owns a house in British Columbia there. And I know that he told me that they were getting leaflets through the door from Chinese investors who were basically offering 50% above the value of the house in cash to buy up streets of houses. Actually, Chinese investors are buying up streets in cash. Well, it could be a pro or a con, depending if you're trying to be if you're just an average family trying to buy a house, you've got no chance. Otherwise, if you're somebody who has the house and owns it, then you have a pretty good selling potential there. But yeah, I mean, San Francisco is one of these places like London as well, which are just insane to rent in or to buy in. For the kind of average, medium, middle class family, it's almost impossible,
Yeah, I think another thing to think about with the registries, you have a lot of fraud. People don't know, especially in developing countries, who actually had the land. And in Colombia, there's a huge problem with land rights because sometimes you buy land from someone, but if you can find that down the line, 3 changes of ownerships ago, that person stole it from someone, that invalidates the person that owns it today. And it's very opaque.
Actually, I've been in the process of buying property here in Serbia, and I've found all sorts of weird laws when it comes to pre-ownership and such. One of them is basically if you're selling a property, you have to offer it to your neighbours first. And within 14 days, if the neighbours decline buying it, you're allowed to legally buy it. But if you don't offer that to your neighbours first, then you're actually breaking the law, and they can come back down the line and sue you for selling that to someone else by not offering it. So these are the type of things, these crazy rules, or maybe not so crazy, maybe that's a fair rule for somebody. But these are these intricacies, as you mentioned, are really problematic, and most people don't even know about them.
Fascinating, right? Like these types of laws. Another one is getting like the building permits, I think. It can be a mess, and getting approval and going downtown to like the city office to get approval to add a deck to your house, things like that. Another one that's really interesting is the Washington Post reported, based on FBI data, that in the fiscal year of 2017, $969 million was diverted or attempted to be diverted from real estate purchase transactions and wired to criminally controlled accounts. So this kind of money wiring scams, again, the transparency of purchases and connecting the money and the transactions to deeds, that's also I'd say an opportunity for blockchain.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of these sort of main problems is a lack of international standard as well. If you're wanting to invest, I mean, we live in a globalized world now. Everyone accepts that we've gone past all these barriers, and pretty much it is a one world system in many respects now. Despite all the things you'll read in the media, it's kind of, But at the moment, yeah, I mean, the lack of international standards is a pretty huge problem, especially in fraud, tampering, the developing countries. I know it sounds maybe harsh to talk about these countries in such a way, but it's much easier to carry out frauds in less regulated systems. So yeah, actually, there's 2 main aspects which we'll get into blockchain, in my opinion, that are going to change things, and that's one of them. Tamper-proof, proof of ownership, and provenance in some ways. Where did the house come from, and proof of who's owned it beforehand.
Yeah, man. So we've talked about the records. We've talked about the middlemen. One last thing is lack of liquidity. This is starting to change. There are some non-blockchain solutions, but being able to own a share of a house, for example, I mentioned San Francisco real estate may be a good investment because the Uber and Airbnb IPOs, if they go public, could raise the prices. But I can't afford even like a closet in San Francisco. But if I could put $500 into San Francisco real estate, that would be cool. And I think there are real estate funds like that right now where you can buy shares without using blockchain technology, but it definitely would be cheaper and more efficient on a blockchain.
This is Vin Armani of Cointext. Make sure to listen to Humans of Bitcoin podcast, part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Stories from people around the world whose lives have been changed by Bitcoin. New episodes every Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, this liquidity problems really stems from, a lot of money in very few hands. So the large investors have huge amounts of capital, but your average mum and pop doesn't really have anything to get involved. If you want to buy anything in San Francisco, as you say, you need to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars even to get probably a garage there. I don't know. But certainly $500,000 is going to get you a small apartment. Who has $500,000 kicking about in your average middle-class family? I don't think many people. So the liquidity is really kind of centralized in certain cities, as you say, and in certain people. So San Francisco, Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Paris. There's only a certain amount of players who can actually play in this game.
For sure. You forgot to mention Belgrade.
Belgrade, it's really cheap, but it's very quickly expanding. There's been huge amounts of foreign investment here, mostly from the Arab states. But yeah, billions and billions of dollars is now flowing into Belgrade. The construction going on is pretty crazy, which in turn is pushing up the whole rent market in the city. So it's happening here very quickly.
If I wanted like a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Belgrade, more or less, how much would it cost?
I stay in, I guess what you could say is a pretty nice place, and it's nearly 100 meters squared, balconies, and I pay just over $400 a month for that. And that's for a new, huge apartment.
But to purchase, though?
To purchase, you're talking about 100,000 euros, 150,000 euros for something that size, which is not much. In London, you would be spending £100,000 to get a garage. And that's not even a lie. You're talking 50, 60,000 just to get a garage now. So there's these emerging markets that if you want to get your foot in the door and you're not rich, like myself, I don't have very much capital, then you have to move, right? And that's cool. I don't mind. You're in Bogota, probably for the same reason, right? Because why would you spend $2,000 a month in San Francisco for a closet when you could live abroad for half the price and have all the same benefits nearly?
I think so. I mean, obviously, if your job is location dependent, meaning like if you're working in London or New York, you're going to get higher salaries. But if you're working more location dependent, you can really affect your financial life in a positive way by living in a cheaper city. There's no doubt about it. One last thing, real estate's so huge, but just applying for mortgages. And this is part of the intermediaries when you buy a house, getting the mortgage, because most people do. Very few people buy houses in all cash, right? And just all the documents, proof of income, utility bills that you're paying, your credit, all that stuff can be identity, right? All of that can be bundled on the blockchain, right? Proving that you're X person, proving that you have X amount of income, proving that you have X amount of assets to show that you're worthy or not. And that can all be analyzed just by enabling your blockchain personal records to a bank or someone who offers that mortgage. Or in the future, there's going to be some kind of decentralized loans, right? So that's another interesting aspect of this whole thing.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a good time to bring up the blockchain in general, right? Bitcoin emerged from the financial crisis in the 06, 07, 08. And this financial crisis was caused by subprime mortgages. I'm pretty sure everyone, maybe not everyone, but many people have seen The Big Short. And there's that fascinating scene in it where they go and interview the real estate brokers who were basically handing 0% deposit mortgages, as far as I remember. Basically giving mortgages to people who had absolutely no means of paying them back. And as many listeners may or may not know, the very first ever, the Genesis block of Bitcoin actually had a reference to the bailout. It was a reference to the Chancellor, Gordon Brown at the time, who was the UK Chancellor. And it was the very first message ever coded in blockchain ever is actually directly related to real estate in many ways, because this bailout happened because of subprime mortgage failures in the real estate market. So I think that's a good point to bring up at the moment, just to reiterate where crypto may have come from. Not just the banks, holding so much control over society in general, but it actually came from the failure of subprime mortgages, which, as we've mentioned, half of the world's assets are held in real estate. So when they go kaput, everything goes kaput. I think blockchain may actually find one of its biggest and most important sort of use cases in real estate.
Yeah, the 2008 financial crisis stemmed by that real estate problem. And one of the problems too, because only some really sharp kind of traders and investigators understood what was going on, but they had to scour over all these records. The information to prove that a big crash was going to happen, that this was an unsustainable bubble, was not obvious. You couldn't analyze this data, right? Because they had to, send me all these records and they had to go through all these files and then come to these decisions, right? Yeah, so that's another, just the transparency or the lack of transparency that we have right now in real estate is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, lack of transparency is obviously a large problem, and blockchain can certainly solve that in some respects. But one of the things that's interesting about real estate is it's not necessarily linked to tangible, or it is a tangible asset, but it's not linked to the standard markets, your S&P and your FTSE and such like. Real estate is some sort of safety net, much like gold and silver. Even if the value of your house goes to zero, you still have a house. You can still live in it. It's still a roof over your head. So there is something slightly different when it comes to talking about real estate in the aspects that, regardless of its inherent value or whatever somebody will pay for it, it still has a certain intrinsic value to the owner, which can never really go to zero. And this is something that's quite important in this field.
So yeah, I think the big opportunities here, and tokenizing assets is another one, right? We mentioned on that, but if you create a coin that can be bought or sold on the open market, buying shares of a piece of property. And I think that for fundraising, for investment purposes, one last thing I want to mention, Stuart, is there are great real estate investment purchases, and there's also the idea of just owning a home psychologically. But I also think that because of the US dollar, we print money, the US dollar loses value, and there's a fixed amount of real estate, relatively, that there's a fixed amount of land, right? Just sometimes buying real estate is simply a hedge against the inflation of the US dollar. So that might be a little bit different if deflationary currencies like Bitcoin gain traction.
Yeah, there is only a fixed amount of land unless you're China, for example, and you decide to build islands, but that's something different. I don't see that as or Dubai, who famously built one of the most ludicrous sort of infrastructure projects ever when they created the 7-star hotel, I think, which is on some islands out there. But yeah, you're correct. Of course, there's only a fixed amount of land on Earth. But at the end of the day, having a house is more important than its actual value, in my opinion. I would rather own a house that I could live in that costs me no rent than it being worth millions and millions of dollars potentially. So yeah, houses are more important in many respects, psychologically, and also just to live in. The value tapped to them, in my head, isn't so important. Of course, people want to live in certain areas, certain locations, next to the beach or whatever, and they're going to be more expensive. But the US dollar is a pretty good example. I don't know what the debt counter is at now for the US, but it's certainly in the trillions of dollars with no sign of slowing down.
Oh yeah, I got to add something there, Stuart. The US lost $1.2 trillion in 2017. And 2017 was a good year. No wars. A pretty prosperous year. So yeah, the debt is safely in the trillions.
I'm pretty sure as well, obviously it's a touchy point with Americans sometimes. 9/11, I think that so-called plane that hit the Pentagon took out your budget department as well, which lost about 1.6 trillion in military spending budgets, which just got wiped off the face of the planet. So these paper monies, as we know, fiat money is something that's very, very suspect of fraud. In any system, including the property system, anything that's backed by paper is fraudulent. That can't be transparent and open to the general public is open to much fraud. So we can use money, we can use property, but essentially the ideas are the same here. We're trying to make things more transparent, and the property market's a good place to start, considering how much it's worth.
For sure. Listen, I think we've covered getting rid of middlemen, financing mortgages, proving ownership, and tokenization. What are some projects that are around now trying to be the solution and use blockchain to improve the real estate industry?
There's a few out there, but I think one of the most interesting ones that we kind of discussed before was Propy, who basically, I was actually looking at their site recently, and they do have properties for sale at the moment for Bitcoin. It's really fascinating. There have obviously been people who have bought properties in the world for cryptocurrency. This isn't the newest development in crypto, but even in Scotland, there's a coin. It's not very well known. It's called Scot Coin. Yeah, very interesting naming conventions. But just last year, a house was bought in Glasgow for Scot Coin. I think it was something ridiculous, like 4.5 million Scot Coin. They don't have a huge value to each one.
Yeah.
But people are using them now to conduct transactions to buy property. And Propy is a website for this, essentially, and also to tokenize, which we'll get into. Tokenizing of assets, really important.
For sure. And we like to reach out to these projects before we talk about them, and they really helped educate us on the current state of the industry as well as their own projects. So thank you so much, Propy, for contributing to this episode. And Stuart, so property registry as well, changing ownership of titles. And they have a pro token, right? How does their Ethereum token, the PRO token, work?
It's an ERC20 token, as all Ethereum tokens are, of course. But Propy basically allows you to change ownership of titles using a property contract. And to do this, you would use their pro tokens, redistributed to Propy's network growth pool. And this would incentivize engagement of users in the platform. So Propy, to make it as simple as possible, is just a way to change ownership of existing titles. And they have their own token to be able to do this as fluidly and simply as possible for the end users.
And that's the pro token. So instead of paying a title company, right, you just buy this token and that will be cheaper and much faster.
And also, as we've come back to, there's a chain, there's a link on-chain, on the blockchain, so you can see the details of what you're buying, where they've come from. It's about transparency as well as ease of use.
For sure.
To be honest, I think it's a great idea, and it's the sort of thing that we need to see more of in real estate. It's a really slow-moving industry, real estate as well. And that's one thing that's kind of talked about throughout the board, is how slow it moves. All these big institutions like law, real estate, take a while to catch on to future innovations, right?
Right. So I'd say the challenges facing Propy are, one, the network effect. They need to get brokers, home sellers, and home buyers on the platform, which is just any startup, right? Just getting the user base. And so they got a little three-sided marketplace there. And then the other thing is regulation, proving that this blockchain registry of properties, can you get government buy-in? And the government has to say, yes, this is valid when it comes legally to buy and sell houses. And so I don't know enough about the regulation and how easy or difficult that is to do. But obviously, if we have this service and, I use the Pro tokens to sell my apartment to you, Stuart, in the United States, and then it's not legally recognized by the government, then that wouldn't work.
Yeah, and also Propy have an incentive-based system as well. So people who sign up for this, register, checking the listed property, sharing stuff on social media, they're rewarded as well via the Propy system, which is something you were mentioning, is to get actual users, the network effect, get people to use this. One of the points that I think we could make here is that real estate is very much old money, right? It's very much held in the hands of quite a lot of large, powerful enterprises, institutions, and also just people who have lots of money. And they're not usually so open to change, certainly not when it becomes transparent. Many of these institutions are quite happy to have the shadier aspects of property in their advantages. So one of the main problems will be getting all this old money to move into this newer system. People like us, we're in our 30s, the kind of millennial generation. This, to us, we're part of crypto, is very normal. This is very obvious to me. Of course you would want to use this type of system. But one of the main problems will be breaking the back of the old money and institutions who don't want to see such a thing change.
For sure, man. And so we'll see how it plays out. I mean, like a lot of industries, we'll see the resistance from the incumbents to change. And Stuart, let's finish off. Explain to the audience why tokenization is a big deal for real estate.
At the moment, if you want to invest in a property, you either have to find a group of people who are going to buy it, or you buy it yourself, which obviously comes to quite a large fund. If you want to buy a house, it may be hundreds of thousands of dollars. But by using tokenization, you could essentially invest $100 into a property, and so could 1,000 other people. And the main city we were discussing about this was like San Francisco. So it's very difficult for a small middle-class investor to get into a property in San Francisco, right? It's really expensive. But if that property can be tokenized, I could invest $100 in there, which is, until this point, unknown of. It's impossible to do so. There are sort of places out there that can do that, but it's not that simple. But on the blockchain, it opens up a huge pool of small-time investors who just want a little part. It could be 1 token to 1 millimeter squared. That could be one of the sort of rulers. So you could invest 1,000 tokens and you would get 10 centimeters, or you would get 100 centimeters squared, depending on however the token's set up. But this is really, in my opinion, one of the biggest disruptors. To be able to tokenize properties and sell tiny, tiny amounts of them to many, many different people, all on the ledger, all transparent. Before, that would be a really difficult process and also potentially impossible through regulation. So it could be done for actual investing into retail or to residential property, or it could also be done in construction. There are blockchain companies who are basically using tokenization to fund construction projects in exactly the same manner. You could get in early and you could pay $200 to get into some property construction development, which may be worth $1,000 a few years down the line, where before that wouldn't really be possible.
Yeah, that's my favorite concept too. In addition to the fraud protection and getting rid of middlemen, I love the idea of just because you don't have a lot of money doesn't mean you can't identify great investment opportunities. And we've all gone by an apartment or a region of a country or a city or a street. Like, man, this is a great place to buy real estate. Only problem is I don't have the money. But if you have an eye for identifying undervalued real estate and you can just buy $100 worth, I think that's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This is the main one. And coming back to the US, I don't have a massive knowledge of the cities there. Let's take San Francisco and Detroit, for example. Detroit is obviously quite well publicized that a lot of the city's in ruins. It's in decay after the car manufacturing industry fell to pieces. That would be a great use case for tokenization, to rebuild these cities that have lost their soul or lost their infrastructure because of a change in economic balance or because the car industries have moved out of them, or any industry. Tokenize this land. Allow the people to then invest into it and to rebuild it that way. That was just something that came to mind at the moment. But Detroit is probably a good example of such a place where you could tokenize, destroyed buildings and decrepit factories and whatever, and allow people to then regenerate it themselves.
Whether it's real estate or a commercial business, right?
Anything.
Buy a token to participate in that. just send a few $100s into the ecosystem.
Yeah, it doesn't even need to be people from Detroit. It could be somebody from, I don't know, Mongolia feels, yeah, Detroit in 10 years, that place is going to be popping. I see it. So I'm going to put $1,000 into that, or 10,000, or whatever the price may be. But it opens up the market to redevelopment in a global aspect. Anyone from anywhere could, invest at the click of a button into somewhere they believe in the next 10 years is going to go. That, for me, is the key to this. I would love to be able to do that. Never been to Detroit or San Francisco for that matter, but I'd be up for investing into, these type of cities or regeneration projects or any of these type of regeneration projects. And right now I can't do it. So that and the transparency are the two key aspects of blockchain can do for real estate.
Wow, super exciting. Like you said, half of the world's assets are in real estate. It's Earth.
Yeah.
Very exciting. Well, listen, listeners, go to bitcoin.com/podcast for the show notes and to subscribe, and we will see you next week.
Yeah, pleasure. Have a good one.
How do you prefer your crypto news? If it's through your headphones, then you'll love this podcast. This Week in Bitcoin is an easy-to-digest news summary published every Friday with a length of 15 minutes or less. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit Bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.